and training offered to citizens of the CARICOM region for the development of their knowledge and skills and competencies in pursuit of regional workforce development and better citizenship. Here in Jamaica, we are faced with a significant challenge when it is that we speak in terms of our workforce. The Jamaica Survey of Living Conditions 2019 indicates that 65.2% of persons in the prime working age population, that is to say between 24 and 55, are without certification. This represents a crisis that we have to tackle. And the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, through the Honorable Minister, Mrs. Favour Williams, has mandated the definition, development, and implementation, ultimately, of a human resource development strategy to tackle this challenge. In order to effectively achieve the end, we cannot ignore the role of the tertiary education system, that is to say, the formal sector, the institutions that compose our colleges, workforce development colleges, our teachers' colleges, our community colleges, our universities, and other specialized institutions. They have a significant role to play. And today, we wish to explore issues related to that role as we speak through the lens of international experience and perspective. What is it that our practitioners globally have learned that will contribute to the conversation here in Jamaica and ultimately leading to an effective strategy that deals with the challenge that I have outlined as emerged through the Jamaica Survey of Living Conditions? The task before us is significant, but we are able, we are ready, and we are committed to achieve. The Jamaica Tertiary Education Commission, with its mandate of developing Jamaica's higher education sector, will facilitate, on behalf of the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, the development of this strategy. The Minister has appointed a task force which includes representatives from critical organs and associations. Planning Institute of Jamaica, the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica, the Jamaica Educators Federation, the Jamaica Confederation of Trades Unions, institutions as represented by the Trenchtown Polytechnic College. We have the Human Resource Management Association of Jamaica included as well. We are, therefore, intent in pulling this group together to be able to speak critically to define this policy. Our diaspora is involved through their network, JDTAN, as we seek to pull them on board to enhance the strategy going forward. We acknowledge the work and the contribution that will be made through the World Bank Group, through UNESCO's ESAC for Latin America and the Caribbean, through partners such as Dr. Ali with the CXC, through other entities who will come on board as we seek to expand this task force to deal critically and strategically with the challenge. We are open to create an inclusive process that will redound positively and sustainably on behalf of our workers. We acknowledge, therefore, this day. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to what promises to be a magnificent feast as we discuss together the enhancement of Jamaica's workforce, enhancing workforce quality through certification, addressing the gaps as they exist now in terms of the lack of certification, a high proportion of the workforce that is untrained, access to and participation in training programs, the lack of alignment of workforce development and training with the labor market, issues of funding, and then certainly underdeveloped processes for the recognition of prior learning. I bid you a good day. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief Executive Officer, the Jamaica Tertiary Education Commission, Dr. Damian Black. As we prepare to have our first speaker, Dr. Roberta Bassett, let me set the foundation for what is expected to be a very productive.
Are you on YouTube?
Also, the Registrar and CEO of CXC, Dr. Wayne Wesley. You see, over the past 10 years, the digital revolution has transformed our working lives, making them more flexible, mobile, and connected than ever before. The COVID pandemic has accelerated this change with its impact that no one could have foreseen. And while the pandemic has given many employees a chance to reestablish work-life balance, it has given businesses a valuable opportunity to rethink their organizational and workplace structures. In concrete terms, the shift to remote working has forced more than 80% of global businesses to accelerate the digitization of processes, with more than 30% also accelerating the implementation of reskilling and upskilling. During defining the worker 20 years ago is totally different from today. As a matter of fact, the primacy of a traditional four-year college degree for a number of job roles is changing. The professional training, occupational associate degrees, vocational certification, industry certification, pre-hire assessment tools, skill-based badging, and other forms of competency validation are creating new pathways to progress and rewarding careers. High-quality micro-credentials provide timely workforce solutions to help meet the needs of employers in recruiting and promoting personnel with the right blend of validated skills within a cost-effective and responsive framework. Here in Jamaica, the Statistical Institute of Jamaica, in their data release April 2021, and Dr. Black quote from it, we have a total population of about 2.7 million, with an employed labor force of 1.2 million. But a large number, over 60%, 747,500 employees are working without certification. I must hasten to admit that this is an improvement since the last 10 years when I've been tracking this data. We moved down from a high of 78% without certification to now just about 62, 63%. But there's much more work that needs to be done. And so our first speaker is Dr. Roberto Bassett, Global Lead for Tertiary Education and Senior Education Specialist, World Bank. Just allow me to share a little about Dr. Bassett. He's a global leader for tertiary education and senior education, providing leadership and technical expertise for projects related to post-secondary education reform initiatives around the world. Her most recent regional work has focused on East and Southern Africa, the new EU member states, the Russian Federation, Central Asian nation, and countries of the Western Balkans. She has been team lead for a variety of tertiary and higher education projects, spanning topics such as finance and quality assurance reform, internationalization of higher education, equity and access, research and competitiveness, and skill development. Prior to joining the World Bank, Dr. Bassett worked in both academia as a lecturer in higher education at the University of Southampton, UK, and managing editor of the Review of Higher Education and Educational Policy and University Administration, including serving as Assistant Dean for Continuing Studies and summer sessions at Stanford University. She is the author-editor of numerous publications, such as Towards Systems That Deliver for All, the forefront of international higher education. Dr. Bassett received her PhD from the Center of International Higher Education in Boston, Massachusetts, from Stanford University, and she also holds a BA from Columbia University. Let us make Dr. Bassett welcome. She will have 15 minutes for her presentation, and then we'll take a few questions after. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Bassett.
Thank you, Mr. Finnegan, and thank you, Dr. Black, for inviting me to speak today. It is a pleasure and an honor, really, to be here. I suspect I'm going to learn as much from all of you as I will offer through my own information, but hopefully what I offer allows a global perspective to come into play in this workshop today. And then I will speak a bit about the World Bank's work in tertiary education, just to set the stage so that the audience today will understand the scope of the World Bank's efforts in tertiary education. And then I will focus a bit on some of the research that the bank has done on explicitly around certification and skills-based certification. So I have some slides, not too many, because I know we don't have a lot of time. I hope the host can actually allow my screen to be shared. And while I'm waiting for that, I'll just talk through a bit of the work that the World Bank has done, and then as soon as they tell me I can share my slides, I will do so. The World Bank works in tertiary education, and as the previous videos have shown, that's what Jamaica is focusing on as well. We don't focus explicitly or specifically on higher education, which is basically considered university education. We look at the entire formal post-secondary sector. And the reasons we focus on tertiary education very broadly at the bank is because we know that tertiary education fosters long-term growth in every country on earth, no matter the income status, low, medium, and high income countries. We also know that workers with tertiary education shocks are more employable and earn higher wages, and we know this is true in the Caribbean region as much as anywhere else. We also understand through research over the past few decades that the rate of return to tertiary education is the highest among all tertiary education, and we see that most prominently in low-income countries. Thank you for allowing me to share. I see that that's been opened for me. And so I've already worked my way partly through this slide. Mr. Finnegan, can you see my slide okay?
Yes, we're seeing your slide.
Perfect, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm here. There we go. And then we know that graduates are wider individual and societal benefits of tertiary education, including health benefits, happiness benefits, and sort of civic participation. So the widespread benefits of tertiary education do substantiate well investing in the sector. So here I just mentioned the rate of return in tertiary education. You can see here comparator across regions and across education investment areas. And I highlighted here the Latin America Caribbean region, which is the region in which the Caribbean is based at the World Bank. And you can see the tertiary education sector has the highest rate of return in the Latin American Caribbean region at about 16%. I suspect you might see that actually being a little bit higher in the Caribbean countries, and that would require some focused research, which would be a pleasure for us to do in the future. But we do know it's a worthwhile investment. Globally, this has also been an area of growth in education enrollments. The enrollments globally in tertiary education doubled between 2000 and 2013, and has increased by an additional 20+% since the 2013. We expect the COVID pandemic to have slowed this a bit, maybe plateauing that enrollment growth pattern. But we also know that the knowledge economy is still driving real investments in the sector by the individuals who want to have a chance to have jobs in that space. And so tertiary education still holds quite a high investment benefit to individuals who will seek it in the future, even when the pandemic has passed. And yet you see this great dispersion, this differentiation across regions and enrollment patterns. We see North America is enrolling about 80+% of its expected age cohort into the tertiary education sector, post-secondary education. Latin America and the Caribbean is just over 50%. And then you get down to sub-Saharan Africa, which is below 10%. This disparity in enrollment rates, this disparity in accessing high skills development through tertiary education is of great concern to those of us at the World Bank who support tertiary education reforms, because this indicates the gap that is growing in accessing the knowledge economy and competing in the global knowledge economy. And this is something that we work very hard with our client countries to close. So the World Bank's support for tertiary education, we've been doing efforts in tertiary education since 1963, and that was first among teacher training programs. But now, as you can see on the right-hand side of my slide, we focus on a broader range of areas now, including public sector development, competitiveness, access and equity, and especially strongly in teaching and learning and improving the outcomes of students, which is something we're talking about today. Here you can just see the dispersion of our project portfolio in tertiary education. Since 2015, the bank has managed a portfolio of about $9.8 billion, making us the largest external financer of tertiary education globally. And you can see the dispersion of the projects. LAC comes in third in terms of how many projects, but considering the size of the regions, this is a pretty fair estimate and is about 16% of our tertiary education portfolio. Recently, we released a study, a policy advisory note, that supports this concept of steering the tertiary education sector. And this is something that the Jamaican Tertiary Education Commission is doing already, doing quite effectively in their sector, but something that we're trying to support our clients in doing more and more, because steering requires a distance, a direction, and a purposefulness to the vision for the sector that we want to support. Most tertiary education sectors around the world are driven still by historic norms, and it's important for those who are stakeholders and leaders in these sectors to take a more sort of pronounced approach to being more aggressive in what they can do with their sectors, as is happening in Jamaica. So of this STEER framework, the first one, which is the one I'm going to focus on most today, is this strategically diversified systems. What kind of institutions do you have, and how well are they articulated so that they can support the national strategic goals and outcomes that are being sought by your government and by your students and by your society? The second is technology, that the use of technology is expanding access, but also creating challenges. How can technology become the tool that you need it to be to support effective and high quality tertiary education? The third is equity. We know we have this need for expanded access. We have it especially in the Caribbean region, where you need to grow your workforce as quickly as possible. That said, who gets to have those spaces in the classroom? What are they learning? What kind of subjects do they have exposure to? What kind of tracking do you have? All of those are giant equity questions to be considered as the systems and sectors get reformed. The fourth section is efficiency. So this is really the foundations upon which your whole sector would be built. Quality assurance that's fit for purpose, governance that is agile and supportive of these innovations that are taking place across the sector, efficient financing and maybe performance-based financing even down the road, and talent management that brings on board those you need to provide the teaching, the research, and the administrative structures that can support your best outcomes. And then the last point is resilience. And this, as has been said already today, is new to even our thinking. I mean, of course, we all thought about sustainability in our initiatives, but this is different. This is about how do you accommodate shocks to your system, but still holding on to your true mission and your identity as an institution, supporting teaching and learning in the future with as little disruption as possible to those who need your systems the most. And so here, as I said, I'm going to focus on this idea of strategically diversified pathways. We look both at institutional types, this array of institutions that have already come up today, this idea that, of course, most systems are anchored by a flagship university.
When it's in our programs, they like to do the online.
Sorry, could somebody mute, please? So we focus on universities as the sort of the anchor, the hub of a system, but of course we care a lot about tertiary vocational, post-secondary education, technical education, and as was said by Mr. Finnegan before, we're thinking more and more about micro-credentials, staff degrees, short-term courses, and even on-the-job training when that's becoming more and more relevant to employers who want to encourage specific skills development. But more than this, we're interested in the pathways that are articulated among all of these institution types so that students can come at the point into the system that makes the most sense to them at that time, but re-enter during the course of a lifetime of learning and reskilling. That this is not a one-directional movement, it's a circular movement, or even something more like a wave that you can come and go at any point. And so here, this is the challenge that I was asked to focus on in my talk today, which is about how do you educate the workforce using competencies and credentialing. And the bank has done a lot of research on this. We don't focus a lot of our lending programs on this because this is still a new topic coming in from our clients, and our projects are very client driven. We are talking more and more though about the holistic environment in which our institutions exist and how that is something that can be shaped not just by academic staff or by the mission of an institution, but by the labor market, by labor market inclusion in the dialogue around how we reform our sectors. And so this is where I'm going to talk most for the remainder of my talk. In the first point, I talk about teaching and learning, that it isn't just about hiring PhDs with great academic credentials, it's also about hiring or retraining your academic staff towards skills and competency-based learning. This is especially true for further colleges, teaching institutions, community colleges, where you know your graduates are directional towards a specific skill-based employment outcome. And developing curricula that then takes into account what the labor market is seeking and embeds that into the reforms, especially for those who are seeking credentials and not necessarily a degree at the end of their studies. Also, this idea of research, and we're not talking in this case about research universities, although of course we know that some of great research institutions exist in your countries and in your region. Here I'm talking about investing in research on learning science and on the labor market. What do your systems know? What do your institutions know about what the workforce of today and tomorrow is going to need? And how is that knowledge embedded into pedagogical reforms and curricular reforms? Research is needed to know that. It isn't enough to have anecdotal understanding about what the market wants. It's really important to be supporting labor market observatories and surveying and labor market inclusion in your industry, academic councils, etc. Again, this next point, focusing on outcomes, we tend to talk a lot in tertiary education about inputs. Do you have enough students coming into the classroom? But we're not talking about outcomes. Do they get the jobs that they should have? Or are your investments in your sectors resulting in economic growth? This is a big macro question, but these are also issues that governments look at when they finance the sectors. It's what students care about when they invest their own money into their studies. And so certification, as important as it is not enough. The labor market needs to value that certification, and it's important then that the outcomes of those certifications are studied and understood, and that interventions take place. If there is a lack of credibility, or if there's just a lack of understanding of the value of certification, the outcome of that certification is really important. And then my last point here is just focusing on private institutions, not just in the delivery of academic studies, but also as employers or as the providers of on-the-job training. These are potential public-private partnerships that can support expanded sort of experimentation around labor market skills development and around the benefits of certification, utilizing the private sector, employers and institutions to test out the validity of certification, to see how much that there's credibility behind the value of that, and how well that will underpin expanding certification for workforce development as a genuine recognition of skills among your populace. And so here I talk a bit, we have this from a World Bank study that I can share my slides, but looking at the different expectations around the advantages of certifications, and different stakeholders have a different sense of what certification can do. Individuals expect that it will show that their skills are valued by the employment employers and the employment market. It'll make them more employable. It'll make them more mobile. This is something that came up already. Training institutions and higher education institutions think more about certification as making their curricula relevant, as finding avenues for labor market involvement in their operations, etc. Firms look at it as a way to have information about who they're hiring, to lower the thresholds or the amount of work that it takes to find the employees that they need. Certification is meant to provide some clarity on what's coming, and so they can have some reliance on that. Governments look at it as providing labor market transparency, that there will be data available. They can make evidence-based decisions on what happens to the graduates and those who are using certification in their employment and in their hiring practices. Trade unions as well look at it as a way of bargaining with employers about the quality of their union members. And all of this is tied around a recognized, trustworthy certification environment that's credible and provides useful information. And so this is my last slide, and it's a slide that I have from the Southern New Hampshire University, which is one of the most innovative universities in the world. And it's a very complex slide. So, you know, again, this is something I can share my slides with all of you, but it shows sort of the circular nature of the relationship between a student, the institution, and the labor market, and shows how the role of the university is transferring. So here we're focusing really on how universities can become much more adaptive to their role as hubs for lifelong learning, for labor market outcomes, and everything that a learner-centric institution can be, putting the student and the lifelong learner at the center of all this. So the university is the curator, getting to know the students, understanding the goals, working through that process as the translator, taking those goals and then providing the skills and curricula to make those goals a reality. Outcomes are credentials, as we're talking about today. And then here, a really interesting idea is the university as the career partner. That over the course of a lifetime, that student can come back and be a learner again to improve their skills and get a new credential or a new accreditation outcome that will benefit them in the labor market. So it's an ongoing relationship that's very circular, and I think this tells a really nice story. And so this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Really was enjoying your presentation. I know we're limited by time. I'll allow for any questions. You may post it in the chat. We'll take one or two questions. And while we await any questions, may I pose one to you, Dr. Bassett? How do we build capacity for workforce training at the tertiary level? The tertiary level seems to lag clearly industry, and industry need work-ready graduates, but the tertiary sector is really lagging. How do we, and is there any best model in the region that we can look at?
I mean, this is sort of the million-dollar question. The one caveat I would put on this, the framing of the question is that the labor market is itself in constant flux. Right? And it's really difficult to sustain any institutions that are meant to produce graduates that can answer that great variability at the labor market level. So one thing to do is to ensure that the soft skills and the transversal skills are embedded in every curricula. So you're teaching critical thinking, you're teaching effective writing, you're teaching leadership and public speaking, and all of those things that benefit any worker in any environment. So, you know, that's especially true at the university level and higher education level. You know, when you're talking about technical education, vocational education, then really the way to do this effectively is to ensure that the labor market is involved in every step of your curricular development, that there's no great distance between academic curricula and what you know, the recipient, sort of the demand side of your education, or who is taking on what you produce through education. Those need to happen hand in hand, so itself, so that the voices are engaged constantly. And then there'll be a lot more trust that what is being produced in your students and their skills.
I have a lot. I just have
I see a hand.
Oh, you see a hand.
There's a hand from Halden Morris.
Oh, yes. Go ahead, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Finnegan, and thank you, Dr. Bassett, for your presentation. Quite exciting. and interesting. I have a number of questions, but I think with respect to time, I'll just ask one. Is there a measure that the World Bank uses to determine the status of institutions as it relates to preparing for the workforce? I think this is a pretty big question too, because we have so many domains that the World Bank operates in, but there must be some kind of measure as to how you treat with that kind of positioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Morris. Yes, this is a very hard issue for us. You know, in all of our projects, and I could spend hours talking about how we build our projects, but in all of them, we have a results framework that then directly ties evidence management, you know, this collection of data, to what our objectives assess whether the interventions have been notable in the labor market throughout the course of implementation. But this is something very explicit to our projects. What we support sort of from a government level is something more closely aligned to tracer studies, right? And that does take a few years to get going, but it's very helpful for a policymaker to know what happens to your graduates and what happens to them at each institutional type. So what happens to your 2-year graduates, your 4-year graduates, your doctoral graduates, and how long can you trace them? There was a system in Bulgaria called the BUR system, the Bulgarian University Registry System, I think it was called. But it was unbelievable in how great it was. It actually tracked students from kindergarten through, you know, retirement, and you could see the progression of them through their education, how much they earned when they finished, how much they earned after a second degree and a third degree. That type of data is invaluable to understand, you know, what your outcomes are for your students. So, you know, in the short term, it's getting a robust annual tracer study going at every stage of terminal completion. So you know what happens to your secondary graduates who don't go to tertiary, and each part of your tertiary sector is also measuring what happens when they complete. That's the most useful, and that's something we try to do in as many countries as possible. It does depend a lot, though, on how prepared the system is for that type of data collection, because it is quite robust. I'm sure Jamaica has the systems in place to do that, but not every country can do that, in which case we try to have institutions do this, so at least they can capture what's happening at the institutional level, even if we can't do it at the system level. I mean, you're right, we could talk about this for a really long time. I'm sorry, I've already taken up too much time. But
thanks for your very comprehensive response. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. My final question is, what is the role of labor unions in workforce education? What is your experience across the globe?
No, I mean, it varies very much on how the historic relationship between labor unions is to their governments and to their labor market. I mean, they do tend to historically have been the advocates for improved learning and professional development of their members. And so in a robust and healthy environment, they're great partners to the employers who take on their workers. They do protect, obviously, some progression through careers, and some of that can be measured through certification. And so trade unions actually have historically in certain places, especially in Europe, played a really useful role in supporting the continual professional learning and development of their workers. I mean, I think that the role of unions in the world has changed quite a lot. And so this is an evolving relationship. You know, they used to be quite robust in the US, and there are very few that are as robust as they were 50 years ago. But the idea that the unions exist to support their workers to be, you know, healthy and well in their work environment also includes skills development, and that can be something that can partner with an educational institution to have a relationship that leads to greater skills development.
Thank you. We'll take our final question from Dr. Wayne Wesley. He's the head of the Caribbean Examination Council, and this body sets exit exams and matriculation exams for our secondary school system. Go ahead, Dr. Wayne Wesley.
Thank you very much, Denver Finnegan. Dr. Bassett, that's her name?
Bassett, yes.
Bassett, Dr. Bassett. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I just want to ask you a quick question as it relates to your learner-centric model. I see you spoke about the ways of learning, and then the skills and competencies are then used for the credentialing. What I want to get your opinion on, and whether or not the World Bank would have been looking at any particular education system that would be making the shift between content and competencies. In other words, we focus less on content and more on the skills and competencies that students ought to demonstrate in order to be functional in society and be competent at what we have asked them to do. And so I know for some programs covering a wide range of content is always an emphasis. Have you seen any program that is beginning to make the shift to more on the competencies that ought to be displayed? Because once those competencies are acquired, students will be able to apply to any content, any knowledge, any area. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, this is something that we've seen not so much in our client countries. This is something that's still emerging. And if you were here before the session started today and they were showing these videos from the Tertiary Education Commission, they showed the video about the National Qualifications Framework. And this instrument, this National Qualification Framework, has become maybe the instrument of what exactly you're describing, of creating a sense of confidence that there is something more than just curricular behind what's happening in education, that there is actually competencies that are being measured and are understood and are actually being guaranteed by the national authority for each level of education in the post-secondary space. You know, in Europe, I mean, what the world is looking at in spaces like this, they look at Switzerland, they look at Austria, they look at Germany, for this idea of the post-secondary technical environment, which is very much about competencies, that it isn't about curriculum, it is about technical education for work, but that can still articulate into the university environment, and that sort of the social contract around that type of education has to be quite robust. I alluded to this a little bit before. You know, you really do need to have a labor market that believes the education system and trusts the education system enough to say, if you tell us they have this skill, we're going to believe you, and that's full stop, right? And that still is something that's emerging, especially in weaker economies, because the labor market and how it relates to education and how it relates to the government and all of these things, these are less robust spaces than we have in other places. But I think the fact that you're building a solid qualifications framework, we see this in other countries, it does create confidence that the institutions know what they're working towards, that students will understand what comes out in the end, and eventually the labor market will see that as something that guarantees some skill understanding. And so this is, you know, this is a sort of save the space, watch the space, because I think in the next sort of generation of learners, there'll be a lot less about what does the teacher know and what are they interested in, and much more about what does a student expect to exit school with in terms of skills and understanding. And that shift is going to make a big difference in how graduates relate and how the society understands what comes out of university education, or really all post-secondary education.
Qualifications, badges and credentials, the principles and practice. So let me just take a minute to introduce Dr. Francesco Pedro. He is the Regional Director of UNESCO International Institute for Higher Learning in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Pedro was formerly Chief of Section of Education Policy at the Division for Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems, at the Division for Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems of the UNESCO Education Sector in Paris. Along with his team, Dr. Pedro has conducted educational policy evaluations in Latin America and the Caribbean, in particular the Bahamas, Guatemala, Honduras, Peru, and St. Kitts and Nevis. He has also contributed to the reinforcement of the work of the education sector regarding the right to education and the use of technology. He has degrees in philosophy and in education, and a PhD in compared education and in Madrid. He also has postdoctoral qualification from the Institute of Education of London. And in 2004, he was appointed Senior Policy Analyst at OECD Center for Education Research and Innovation in Paris, where he led projects on learners for the new millennium and research and systematic innovation in education. And of course, he has written many books and scientific and also scientific articles in various fields to include politics, education, teaching, and higher education. Let's make welcome Dr. Francesco Pedro. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's really a pleasure being with you, and I would like to express openly my gratitude to Dr. Black for allowing the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean to be part of this conversation. I'm going to share with you a short presentation that has actually two different parts. The first part is about how we at UNESCO see the two most important challenges that higher education is facing in the region. This is important because this kind of diagnosis, in a way, is a preparation for the upcoming World Higher Education Conference that UNESCO has called for in May 2022, in which we hope to design, together with our partners, with governments, with higher education institutions around the globe, the agenda for higher education in the next decade. So let me start by sharing with you just two of the main challenges as we see them. Of course, you may see different challenges, but I'm trying to do my best to present challenges that seem to be really upfront at regional level. The first one for us, seen from our perspective, and I'd like very much to insist on that, everyone is invited here, but seen from our perspective, the region has a problem with both quality and relevance of higher education. And I think that many would say that certainly there is still a prime attached to those who complete higher education compared to those that can only reach secondary education. And certainly this is true. And in our region, particularly in South America, the premium attached to completing a degree in higher education could be almost three times the earnings that someone with similar socioeconomic characteristics could earn just having a secondary high school degree. So I think that we still have that premium, but still we have many questions about the relevance of what we teach. We have also a problem, and I would like you to focus on this figure. We have a problem when it comes to the internal quality of our provision. On average, for the whole region, and that would include the Caribbean as well, we have quite a low graduation rate. I mean, it's below 50%. And that means that every 10 students that in a given year get access to higher education in Latin America and the Caribbean, say 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, whenever their programs are expected to end, only less than 5 complete their degree. Does it mean that those not completing do not learn anything? Let me leave the question open. Because I think that you are going to find probably a response to this in the second part of my presentation. So for me, this is certainly an issue. I mean, it's about graduation rates, and it's about the internal efficiency of our provision. And then we have another challenge, which to me, or to UNESCO, is just the other side of the same coin, which is about equity and inclusion. And I think that no matter how important for people like us, the ones following or participating in this meeting, higher education is, the fact is that our region has a real problem with equity. Let me just share with you another figure. This case is lower, looks lower because it's only about 7, so only one figure. But that's the difference. 7 times likely to go to higher education if you are in the quintile 5 as opposed to the quintile 1. And that means that the likelihood of attending higher education is pretty much related to your socioeconomic status. And it's not twice as much depending on how rich you are. It's not 3 times, it's not 4 times, it's 7 times on average. And that's really impressive. Of course, in the region, we have, we can rank the countries, and in some cases, I mean, it's only, sorry to put it this way, it's only 2 times higher the likelihood of attending higher education if you are richer. But in other countries, particularly in the Central American triangle, it can be as high as 18 times. So, you know, we have this double-faceted problem. On the one hand, we have an internal efficiency problem, no matter how important the premium of graduating for higher education is. And then, on the other hand, we have also a problem with equity. So not everyone is really entering higher education in a context where we would like to see that our economies are making big steps towards becoming what we call usually knowledge-based economies. So economies where the labor force is more here than in the hands, okay? But this is still something for which we are still dreaming, I would say. But certainly the provision of our education system seems to be prepared really for that nice concept of the knowledge economy. Now, we still have a third issue, which might be not really relevant to many of you, but it is for UNESCO. And so far as I know, it is also important for Jamaica, which is related to mobility and internationalization. I think that the UNESCO, our organization, has made a big step when it comes to making sure that we have international conventions that protect the rights of the lucky students that are able to go abroad to complete their higher education or to get even their first degree in higher education. I mean, we have a global convention, we have a regional convention that when getting into force will facilitate the process of having your certificates, your qualifications recognized mutually, okay? But we are not still there. And as a matter of fact, in this case, maybe because it's so important for UNESCO, the promotion of internationalization, let me share with you something which is really very sad. And to begin with, only 38% of the Latin American and Caribbean students that decide to go abroad to complete their certificates, their higher education qualifications, remain in the region. So that means that the attractiveness of our higher education systems in the region is not really so high, maybe because we have a problem in the perceived quality of our own systems. And that could be the case of your system, but certainly it's the perception of your students when deciding to go to another country. They hardly trust, so to say, the provision offered in the rest of the region. But even more importantly, once again, seen from the perspective of equity, I mean, we have to recognize that only 1.1% of all Latin American and Caribbean students really have the opportunity to study abroad. So we are talking really, as per today, of the benefits of really an elite, except in those cases where we have really either the public funding or sometimes the private funding that are doing their best to ensure that whoever is talented really can benefit from this transformational opportunity that mobility represents. On our side, being simply a technical agency without any funding capacity, we can only do our best to promote the idea that your rights will be protected if you are lucky enough to have the opportunity to study abroad. So this is really important because as far as I know, there is a huge amount of Jamaican students going abroad, not only for university education, but for many different kinds of higher education provision, and then willing to see their qualifications recognized when returning home. This has been the first part. So this is how we see the region. Not necessarily could be the picture for Jamaica, although in my acknowledged ignorance of how Jamaica is doing, I would say that the situation in your country is really far better than the one I have depicted for the whole region. But the question here for me was whether there is a role in a system like yours for flexible approaches to certification. Let me start that, to begin with, we come from, in our region, we come from systems of higher education provision very much used to have formal certification procedures. We all recognize, no matter if there is no agreement or bilateral or multilateral agreement for the recognition of certifications, but we all understand each other when we say that we have a master's degree, when we say that we have a PhD, we all understand that. But what happens when someone hasn't completed, fully the degree? What happens when someone, let me give you an example. Someone claims that knows quite a lot about wine, and simply that could be the case of my wife. Sorry to be so personal. I mean, she never followed any course on wine or spirits for that matter. And then when we are at the table, we always look at her to get advice about what wine we should take. And she is the one also testing the wine and usually getting excellent results. Now, I don't think she is willing now to move to another profession. She is currently a nurse, but why not? And if she decided to move to the work for a restaurant as a sommelier without any formal qualification, would that be possible for her? Even having a large community, say, of friends and family acknowledging her skills. Well, this is the domain of alternative pathways to learning that really need and can benefit from the recognition of learning that comes without any formal qualification, that has been the result of simply your experiences in work or in leisure, why not? And that have created a new set of skills that hasn't been recognized by the formal systems. So increasingly, we see in the region a demand for the creation of flexible learning pathways that help, to begin with, help our workforce to see that whatever progress they are making in their skills and competencies is duly recognized by the system and translates into something that has value in the market, or sometimes has social value. The truth is that sometimes, and I'm taking this picture from my colleague Susana Karakayan, I mean, sometimes one tends to believe that the resulting picture will be something like this Frankenstein monster effect, where we are going to create something that, instead of our formal approach to credentials and qualifications, is going to be much more complex. But what's the problem if this works? What's the problem if you can still live comfortably in a place that doesn't comply with our expectations with what an apartment should look like? Is it comfortable? Is it something you would like really to enjoy or not? I mean, that's what I think we have in front of us. Now, Jamaica has been one of the pioneering countries when it comes to national qualification systems and frameworks, which represent really a major opportunity to make progress when it comes to precisely the recognition of flexible pathways. To recognize that alternative pathways may exist, you have to understand and have a clear statement about really what do you consider to be skills and competencies, and how you plan to certify, to assess and certify them. In that respect, I think that it is very important to recognize that national qualification frameworks, as the one in Jamaica, not only provide us with the opportunity to map my own skills and competencies against a formal map, no matter if it comes from a broader perspective, but also it allows policymakers and providers of higher education to identify the weak points, meaning by that, areas that require, so to say, or could benefit from additional effort from either the government or the providers. So I think that it is important to recognize that national qualification frameworks are increasingly opening to what is the emergence of alternative learning pathways outside formal education. So in fact, historically speaking, the majority of national qualification frameworks I know of have originated from the formal education and training system, but they are increasingly moving towards having a more comprehensive perspective that, rather than putting the emphasis on credentialing, is putting the emphasis on skills and competencies, on the individual that is willing to demonstrate what is he or she capable of doing, and to attach value in the labor market to that. So that comes as no surprise that in the past 2 or up to 4 years, many systems in the many frameworks in the region have initiated already the conversation about how to take into account, how to make accountable those alternative ways of learning. In that respect, I think that it is important to realize that national qualification frameworks can really make a difference if we are thinking, as my predecessor has mentioned, we are thinking about not simply making sure that we cut where we are at this particular moment in time when it comes to the skills of our workforce, but rather have a long-term perspective that brings in the benefits of a lifelong learning approach. And I think that that's precisely one of the most important benefits. You are not simply getting a picture, a photograph of where you are now. You are really getting a video that is able to show you where you are now, where you come from, and how far you are making progress along the course of your life. And certainly, I think that to make this happening, we need to make sure that not only the government and the traditional providers of education are involved. We need to make sure that all stakeholders who have a saying when it comes to education and learning, particularly learning related to the labor market, have really an opportunity to participate. Of course, that means that having a national qualification framework is just the beginning of a journey that nobody knows exactly how it's going to finish, because it's something that, well, you may think we already have that, so let's take it for granted. No, come on. A national qualification framework has to evolve because our economies and our education providers are also evolving. Same applies to the expectations, both the social and economic as well as labor market or labor-oriented expectations. They are also evolving. So we need to make sure that in our national qualifications frameworks, we really gather in a systematic way the required information to monitor the developments that are happening outside, so as to make sure that the frameworks are constantly adapted to new needs and new developments. There are many examples of how national qualification frameworks have been evolving over time. Let me just provide you with some examples. For instance, it is important to recognize the success of national qualifications frameworks, because out of 200 countries that we have roughly in the world, 150, as per today, 2021, have already national qualifications framework. And we have even regional attempts, as it is the case here in the region. But certainly, we have also some countries that have seriously started the reform, a profound reform of their national qualification system. The most important examples I have in mind are those of France and Australia, which before the pandemic hit, already started thinking about how can we make sure that our national qualifications framework that originated in the 20th century become not simply the reflection of what the economy at that time was requiring and expecting, but also a tool to plan the needs of, in terms of workforce development that our countries will have throughout the next 2 generations. So it's quite a complex problem. In fact, there are even more examples of countries that haven't started yet a reform process, but have decided to undergo a serious evaluation, because they suspect probably that they need to do something about improving the match between the national qualifications frameworks and the reality of both the provision and the demand of education. This is the case, for instance, a particular case I like very much to bring on the table of South Africa. So we have plenty of examples of the transformation, and usually this starts with gathering really an important knowledge base about the behavior of national qualifications framework. And so we get to know already what the benefits are for those countries that have already well-developed systems. And at the same time, also, we recognize through these many evaluations, particularly very interesting in Western European countries, where we have found that the full potential of national qualifications framework hasn't been really exploited to the full. So it's not simply about the mismatch between the current framework and the reality of our economies and our societies, but it's also about the fact that the main stakeholders, the main end users, be that the citizens themselves, or the companies or even the public service, are not really knowledgeable about what the national qualifications framework can do for them in order to provide them with better job opportunities, or simply to make sure that what they are looking for is really found or expressed, a way of expressing their demands that really can be easily matched. Of course, let me just finalize with a reminder of the benefits that are attached to the existence of national qualifications framework. Among others, I would say that it is the best way that we know at the moment to provide a clear picture of the landscape of our qualifications, of how far, not simply our workforce have reached different levels of formal education, but actually what kind of actual competencies they have. And it is important because the plans that we have for the economy, for socioeconomic development, may not be matched with the existing pool of skills and competencies. So in a way, I think that the most important benefit of having a national qualification framework that works is simply that is providing us the tool for mapping the gaps that our development project may have according to the reality of our workforce. But at the same time, I would like also to say that the existing evaluations of national qualifications framework, as the ones I mentioned before, already provide us with some examples of either the weaknesses or areas where we have mixed results according to countries. And I think that this is certainly related to the lack of connection between learning outcomes, as for instance accounted for in international learning assessments, and the depiction of the skills and competencies as they appear in national qualifications framework. So some countries find themselves looking at the rankings, so to say, of how their 15-year-olds are doing, and then they cannot map the kind of exercises that come with these international learning assessments with their own national qualification frameworks, or sometimes it happens even with national examination systems. The second one, which is still the most important issue that we have now in front of us, is how difficult it still is to make sure that qualifications that do not come from education, from formal education, that may come from other sectors, like, for instance, health, the industry, or even from non-formal education, are also included. So I think that just mapping qualifications is not enough. We need to make sure that the framework is really a living body that can take into account the developments happening also outside the sector. And finally, I would say that we have issues related finally to the use of national qualifications framework. And these are mostly related to the visibility, as I already mentioned, our, I would say, rather weak efforts to communicate properly what would be the benefits for you as a student, for you as a worker without qualifications, for you as an employer, to make reference to the national qualifications framework. I mean, unfortunately, it looks like in many countries, the only ones who are knowledgeable about NQFs are the ones who have designed it, not really the end users. And this is really a pity, because there is a lot of effort put on their development, and at the same time, a lot of potential. So, and frankly, I think that the very last area for which we need some kind of further development is this idea of articulation and permeability. So the need for our national qualifications framework to make sure that we recognize that, even, as I said at the beginning, even those young people who have at some point entered higher education but who never completed a degree, as a matter of fact, they may have learned important skills. Maybe some of them, not all of them, but maybe some of them could even have an important value in the labor market. So it is important that we do our best to ensure not only that we recognize what they are able to do, but also that thanks to this permeability, so to say, of the system, by way of recognizing that they haven't lost their time, we invite them to continue educating themselves in formal or non-formal systems. So I think that it is very important, and I would like to finalize my presentation with this idea. It is important not only to have a system, but to have a framework that is constantly evolving. It should be a living body, and at the same time that we put as much effort on communicating the benefits of having that living body among us as we have put in the past on their development. Thank you very much, and I hope that this helps the conversation. Thank you very much, and back to you.
Thank you very much. It helped the conversation, although it has provided more questions to the conversation, especially the last part that you ended with. NQF not fully exploited, right? It's largely only known to those who have developed it and have put in a great amount of work. And my question, clearly, as we take just one other question, here in Jamaica, we launched our NQF around about 2017, so going over 4 years now. But it hasn't been utilized by the tertiary institutions, and not many potential candidates are aware of the NQF. Any recommendation, any suggestions as to how we can promulgate the NQF for it to work for those it intended to work for, as we seek to increase also our low certification rate here in Jamaica? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that the question you are posing is extremely important, and I don't have a simple answer to that. I think that what you need to create is a system of incentives for the providers, so they can not simply refer to the NQF, but actually see the benefits for them of making sure that whatever program they launch is really connected to the national qualifications framework. And they need incentives for them to see what the benefits are. And I think that the most important benefit for them would be to connect for instance, the levels of employability of the graduates of these corresponding programs with the expectations in terms of competencies and skills and the demand for those in the labor market. So I think that the question should be, how can we make sure that the currency that the providers of higher education are using is really the currency that the country has decided it should be, which is the NQF. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any raised hand? Are there any questions? If there are no more questions, I'll just ask one as we move to the final presentation, well, the third presentation. You mentioned across Latin America and the Caribbean, less than 50% of our graduates, our students who enter tertiary education, complete their four-year college degree. With that said, are you seeing across the region credit banking or improvement in micro-credentials? So yes, you may hope to complete a four-year program, but after 2 years, you have enough skills, so you move to a job or finances. Are you seeing where those 1, 2, 3 years are being transitioned or transferred into micro-credential or credit banking across the region?
Thank you very much. Well, I think that I have to respond as if you were putting this question 2 years before now, before the COVID, before the pandemic, I'm trying to say, because the landscape may have changed, who knows, dramatically. I think that the region, and maybe most Caribbean countries are an exception to this, but when it comes to continental Latin America, I would say that it's a very formalistic type of economy where people haven't yet entered the dynamics of micro-credentials. They still believe that having a micro-credential is simply, showing your inability to complete a full degree, rather than seeing the potential in having a short provision of education that really ensures or grants you the access to skills and competencies that are in high demand in the economy. I think that we have to educate not only our workforce when it comes to really acknowledging the benefits of micro-credentials, but also our companies, our employers who are not really still taking part in that conversation. We have only a few higher education institutions that have started the conversation about micro-credentials in Latin America. They are still, I would say, they fear that there would be a loss, a perception of loss in quality if they enter the market of micro-credentials. While if you look north, you will realize that there is a huge market evolving that now has started to pose the question on how to qualify this immense array of provision that is emerging. In higher education formal programs, we all have quality assurance agencies or mechanisms that protect the interest of the country and the interest of the citizen. When you enter the domain of micro-credentials, who is responsible? Who is accountable? Now, I think that you need to have really a very innovative mindset to really enter that domain. And unfortunately, I would say the majority of our economies and societies in Latin America is not yet there. Sorry to be ending with such a sad message.
All right, thank you. There are so much questions that we could ask. but we hope that the conversation will continue. We want to thank you for spending the time with us.
Thank
and
you.
We look forward to getting a copy of your presentation. Thank you.
With pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. I know you have been seated for a while. I'll ask you that you stand and stretch if you're around your desk. And as we prepare for our third presentation, we'll be looking at flexible learning pathways and human resources development. Flexible learning pathways and human resources development, such an important aspect of moving our workforce forward. And we will have Dr. Ali, who I'll introduce shortly, to guide us through this presentation. Flexible learning pathways and human resources development. You know, I make a comment or two here. The World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report pointed to double disruption of automation and pandemic. It says that 85 million jobs will be displaced by 2025. But among those set to remain, 50% will need reskilling. And 50% meaning 50% workers will need reskilling. And to make Dr. Ali's presentation so more important about flexible learning pathways and human resources development. As a matter of fact, same World Economic Forum indicated that COSARA and EDROC saw 400% and 150% respectively growth in learner sign-up during the pandemic. So COSARA is an online platform where you can just sign up for any courses, open access. You may have to pay for your final credential. And the rapid onboarding to online learning offers enormous possibilities, but there are some challenges. And I hope Dr. Ali's presentation will speak to some of the things to do, and the things that we need to improve in the region as it relates to providing universal access to connectivity, promote a thriving ecosystem of skill-based credential, and building the currency of micro-credential as we look at flexible pathways and create a widespread access towards online learning as we seek to have productivity in the region that has been low for 40 to 50 years improve. And so let me introduce to you our next speaker. Dr. Eduardo Ali is a pro-registrar and deputy chief executive officer of CXC. Dr. Ali joined CXC, and that's the Caribbean Examination Council, on August 1st, 2021. And he is the deputy CEO, as I said earlier, and leads the strategic thrust here in the Western Zone office. And the Western Zone office is Jamaica. He's responsible for research and educational services. He also, his career of nearly 3 decades has positioned him in key roles in the Caribbean and North America, the United Kingdom and the Middle East within the field of education. And those include Executive Director of the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago, Senior Manager of 2 universities in the United Arab Emirates, and Program Manager, Human Resource Development, responsible for education and labor at CARICOM Secretariat in Guyana. In addition, Dr. Ali has held leadership and technical roles within the University of the West Indies, both at Cayville and St. Augustine campuses. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask that you make welcome Dr. Eduardo Ali, Pro-Registrar and Deputy CEO of the CXC, as he speaks to us on flexible learning pathways and human resources development. Over to you, Dr. Ali.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Finnegan, for your kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the Jamaica Tertiary Education Commission, and more specifically, Dr. Black, for having invited me to be a presenter today. It's really a pleasure and a privilege for me to share a few thoughts with you, particularly as it relates to my own researcher's experience and my practitioner's experience over the years. What I'd like to focus my presentation on is not just the issue of flexible learning, but the issue of new credentialing as we talk about human resource development, and certainly the issues associated with respect to the advancement of the new forms of credentialing in the region. So if you can allow me, please, to share my slide with you. I'm hoping that you are seeing what I have in front of me. So, as I indicated, what I really want to do in this presentation, as I reflect on the topic, but also look at flexible learning pathways, which was a subject of a previous discussion forum that you would have held, is to look more deeply at the issues around credentialing and quality as we talk about the issues associated with human resource development in the Caribbean region. I know that we all agree, and we've heard today, that the pandemic has really influenced our environment, where there's stark changes to policies and practices, as you heard from our two previous presenters. And those have immensely impacted our country's responses to tertiary education and training delivery. So we are forced, in some respects, to rethink our traditional models and modes of learning, which we can recognize has somewhat become obsolete today. And therefore, we have to quickly explore, exploit, and transform our education and training sectors and systems so that they're indeed future-proof, but also impactful for the learners who we serve. Now, let me add some more context to the discussion. And some of this has been said by our moderator earlier. We recognize that there's an inextricable connection between the global labor demands, the workforce development requirements, and certainly the role that tertiary education and training systems play. As he would have indicated, the World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report would have spoken to the need for a repositioning of our systems. Because we are now in what is Industry 4.0 amidst the presentation of 5.0 before us, where we are talking about new production models for learning. And of course, this brings us to a place where we have to look at the greater synergies between human empowerment, people performance, and the use of machineries or devices. And so for us, when we talk about knowledge workers in the 21st century, what we consider to be the requirements for knowledge has now changed, because we are talking about data, artificial intelligence, machines, and technologies that are driving what we consider to be the rudiments of our workforce. And of course, with that, we have seen the rise in the healthcare services industry, supported by big pharma and biomedical and health technology industries. We've also noticed that there are digital economies that are emerging, focused on financial technology, blockchain, cloud computing, e-commerce, e-business, and the works. And of course, as we talk about new forms of technology, we are looking at the issue of the green industries and the role that these play as we speak to the issues surrounding climate, food security, and environmental sustainability. You would have also heard some discussion about surveys that would have been conducted. One such survey that was done by the International Labour Organization in 2020 that looked at 114 countries, spoke to the issues associated pre and post and mid-pandemic around skilling, reskilling, and upskilling of employees, apprentices, and trainees. And what they found is that employees' learning and career development pathways have been significantly affected, especially for small, medium, and micro enterprises. And so we must indicate, as a result, that we are in a situation where the pandemic has caused us to be unprepared, of course, and so our education and systems are playing catch up. And to a certain extent, This is evidenced by unresponsive country policies, the issue of looking at urgent demands by industry for rapid training, and of course the inflexibility and incapability of universities, colleges, and some TVET institutions who are not just producing what is required in terms of learning systems on time. And so I want to pose the question today, if it's possible, do we want to be headed to a dead end in our education and training delivery? Or do we want to re-engineer, innovate, and disrupt the education and training space in the Caribbean, and notably in Jamaica, with a myriad of possibilities so that we are filling the labor gaps where they are required in our societies? And so that brings me to a few key concepts that I'd like to share with you as we talk about the issues associated with building a quality workforce through credentialing. And the first is we must recognize the value of flexible learning. And that flexible learning is really about philosophies, models, systems, and practices that we establish to facilitate choice for learners, the issue of convenience in terms of what they learn, the benefits of having personalized learning opportunities so that we cater to individualized learners' needs as opposed to institutional needs. Quite often we think in higher education and some other institutions about what is best for faculty, but really what is best for the learner. And of course, we need to look at competency-based credentialing as a form of credentialing in the current environment. When we consider the need for workforce development, we restructure technical vocational education and training, and we consider the CBET practices where education and training is looked at the competency-based level. And so that brings us to the issues associated with micro-credentialing and nano-credentialing, which I'll explore a little later. And so for us, we recognize that countries and institutions, we have to consider what is needed to be flexible. And as I asked the question before, are we really flexible? And so there are some things that we would want to think about as we consider what flexible learning models are for our institutions. The first is, as was indicated by our previous speakers, that it requires strategies, policies, and procedures, not only at the macro level, but at the institutional level, so that we support both institutionalized and individualized education and training. And as such, structures should rethink the philosophy of learning and recognize that learning is at the core of what we do. And so we focus on self-directed and self-actualizing adult learners. This must place some priority in our considerations. The second is the issue of the alternative pathways that we consider. We've heard some talks earlier about that particular issue, and the extent to which different institutions, modalities, modes, and approaches are encouraged. So alternative pathways need to emphasize, recognize, certify, and accredit formal, informal, and non-formal education and training so that we are ensuring that we are truly flexible in our approach. The third is that flexible learning should be focused on competency-based learning and credentialing. That is to say, we need to ensure that we're developing learners and issuing credentials for competence, whether we are talking about micro and nano credentials or macro qualifications or awards. And that is where prior learning recognition, or PLA as it's called in some instances, is seen as a key measure for ensuring that learners, regardless of where they participated in learning, in informal, formal, and formal contexts, are given considerations. So I'd like to speak to a few international examples, those that I have looked at over the years, that I think would be beneficial to you as we consider the issues associated with flexible learning pathways and the impact, prior learning and the relationship with flexible learning pathways. And so I want to look at three regions, the United Kingdom and Europe, and a couple examples there, the Middle East and Northern Africa, and the South Pacific. And I'd like to start by speaking to the case of Ireland, where in Ireland, in support of their national skills strategy, they actually established what is called the Education and Employment Project. And that project was designed to bridge the divide between employment, or rather unemployment, and higher education institutions and the programs that are offered. And what they sought to do was to create flexible pathways that were responsive to the needs of employment, focused on upskilling and reskilling of employees in the labor force. It was a partnership approach that allowed for those persons with a key emphasis on migrants who were coming in from other jurisdictions into Ireland to access learning so that they could fast track into attaining professional qualifications and academic qualifications. In the second instance, in France, the validation of prior learning, or VAE as it's called, had some challenges since it was first established in 2002 because of the fact that the higher education institutional uptake was not very good. In fact, its true success was with non-formal and informal learning involving the labor force. And so the validation of professional qualifications, or VPQ as it's called, was created to allow students to enter university without the required academic qualifications. And of course, the validation of professional experiences allow persons, whether they were employed or not, to get access to prior learning for entry into higher education institutions. In terms of the Middle East, I want to speak to two brief examples. One is speaking to the issue of qualifications frameworks, which you would have heard from the previous presenter. And in the UAE, the QF Emirates, which is this national qualifications framework, which established 10 levels for vocational and academic macro qualifications, introduced a mapping methodology to align program level learning outcomes to the level descriptors and competencies in the qualifications framework. Interestingly, all lifelong learning offerings, which included prior learning assessment and recognition, were considered at all levels, both in vocational education as well as in academic education. And this is currently being modeled across institutions who are responding by putting the structures and policies in place to encourage lifelong learning in the institutions of higher education. In the context of Bahrain, they actually had a challenge in that higher education institutions were constrained to only recognize prior learning gained from non-formal and informal learning. From formal learning and not from non-formal or informal learning, so that they recognized credits that were only issued by higher education institutions and not outside, which for persons coming into the Bahrain from other contexts who are working, it has presented huge challenges. And for the South Pacific, in Australia, Skills Certified Australia has established a similar scheme through what are called registered training organizations in Australia. And what they have sought to do is establish the mechanism by which individuals are assessed for an industry-based qualification, like we have in the region, and of course, guidance officers and faculty or institutional assessors played a very important role in assessing a portfolio of evidence to support the award of prior learning. And in the Fiji Islands, the Australian government, through Australian aid, funded what is called the APTC, the Australian Pacific Training Coalition. That was a similar RPL scheme that was designed in Australia, and that too has been reaping some benefits in the Fiji Islands. Now let's turn to the Caribbean region, where I know many of us are very familiar with and we have a lot of fondness for in terms of our practices. And so the Caribbean experience is like much like many other territories. One of the practices that we have seen is the establishment of corporate assessment centers, which are managed by Caribbean employers, and sometimes in partnership, of course, with psychometric assessment experts in recruitment firms who assist in terms of selection and training and development of employees. In one study I conducted in Trinidad and Tobago on behalf of UNESCO, where I looked at what is called RVA, Recognition, Validation, and Accreditation of Prior Learning, we identified 29 workforce assessment centers across the country in 50 occupational or industry areas that were both in urban and rural jurisdictions. What we found is that there were multiple validation levels focused on the individual right to access and obtain certification rather than that of the institution where they gained their qualification. And this was seen as a vehicle for the award in full or part of competencies or units for the National Vocational Qualification in Trinidad and Tobago, and the Caribbean Vocational Qualification. Legislation, as you know, governing the establishment of national accreditation bodies gave authority to such bodies to establish credit transfer schemes for post-secondary and tertiary education institutions. And what many bodies have been doing is establishing the national qualifications frameworks like you have here in Jamaica to be articulated to the CARICOM qualifications framework. And so policies and structures are being designed to facilitate credit accumulation and transfer. But very importantly, Caribbean higher education institutions and awarding bodies have traditionally managed bilateral or multilateral arrangements for articulations of credits and awards. And so prior learning would have been considered by many of them as they looked at these articulation arrangements. So I just want to say that for the past decade, credentialing models have been growing with increasing intensity and variety, and we've heard some of that earlier being expressed. The primary issue here is about having assessed learning paths. Whether you take assignments or you participate in creating portfolios of competence, you engage in seminars, conferences, in exercises that are conducted, or their direct observations of work. These are usually the main methods for assessing prior learning and, of course, creating paths for further learning and development of people who are in the workforce and, in some instances, technical and vocational education institutions. And as you would have heard earlier, sometimes you have what I refer to as additional, alternative, and complementary certifications, where prior learning recognition schemes are in place, and these are to ensure non-duplication of learning so that we have persons in the workplace getting recognition, and this is becoming a mainstream now in terms of credentialing. In a study conducted by Ernst & Young over the past 5 years, what we found is that in the region, in North America and in the Caribbean, 40% of university degrees are being seen as becoming obsolete within a decade, and therefore traditional undergraduate and postgraduate degrees seem to be disappear. And this study was actually conducted with employees in organizations. And we know that Industry 4.2 and now 5.2 are push factors for the establishment of new credentials for industry. And so they are important to facilitate talent development in organizations, for managing performance in organizations, facilitating formal matriculation, and enabling lifelong learning, whether that comes through provides for personal recognition of the individual or social engagement in the credentialing process. So we have to appreciate that credentials are not developed in a vacuum. There's an ecological framework that was developed to look at new credentials as depicted in the diagram. And it reveals that there are 4 types of credentials. 2 of them on the right are now becoming mainstream, like micro-credentials and nano-credentials. But the 2 principal factors that will determine the type of credential that is to be established are indicated here. The first being what we call bundling or unbundling. Bundled credentials are really macro credentials. So we have certificates to degrees that are usually administered by higher education institutions and some TVET institutions. In terms of those professional and related awards, we see non-accredited awards being very regularly established in some instances where the workforce is engaged in developing credentials. There are also what is called unbundled credentials, and these are smaller stackable bits, which may be formal or semi-formal accredited micro-credentials, or informal and non-formal digital badges, which are nano-credentials. The second principle I want to speak to as we think about quality in terms of credentialing is the issue of the award of credits. Both macro-credentials and micro-credentials attract variable credits. In New Zealand, the New Zealand Qualifications Authority established a micro-credential framework where micro-credentials are measured anywhere between 5 to 40 credits, and anything beyond 40 credits are seen to be macro-credentials. So nano-credentials, however, have been identified as not having attracted credits, but can be stacked and contribute to the development of or issuance of micro-credentials. 27% of post-secondary credentials, interestingly, in the United States, have adopted digital badges, whilst MOOCs in particular, massive open online courses, only represent about 1% of the offerings, but that is increasing. And we know that MOOCs and nano degrees are fast becoming a demand with the advent of Coursera, edX, Udacity, and other commercial learning platforms, as you would have heard from our moderator today. So let's talk about the typology of a microcredential. What is a microcredential and how is it structured? Because it's important for us to understand the typology, which I've shown in the diagram. While I know it may be hard for viewing by all because of the way the diagram is depicted, there are 6 core components in a microcredential framework offered at a sector level or at the institutional level. And the first we need to establish is the purpose of the microcredential. For example, is it a pathway to receive a formal qualification? Is it intended to be an update of a previous microcredential? Is it a means to gain new technical skills or the transferable skills or transversal competencies that we want persons to acquire? The second has to do with the mode of delivery of the microcredential, looking at whether this is best done in person, by a hybrid means, or fully online modes, which I know many of us are very concerned with now. The third aspect looks at the flexibility of the microcredential. Is it a fixed-paced course? Is it a hybrid model? Or is it self-paced? So the learner could take the microcredential on their own time and start and stop and continue as they so choose. The fourth aspect is that of the interaction between the learner and the facilitator. Microcredentials can allow for cohort-based learning if you want to put that sort of structure in place, or you can facilitate independent learning where each individual is managed independently, or you can have a combination of both depending on your model. The fifth looks at whether the microcredential is issued by paper, digital means, or both. And finally, the sixth speaks to the indicator of achievement of the microcredential, which is extremely critical because the learner may achieve the microcredential purely by participation or by demonstration of competence as they pursue the microcredential, or the mastery of a skill or competence, which quite often labor is very interested in. So what all of these components seek to address is a common set of rules or principles governing how we design, develop, administer, and deliver our microcredentials. Now, having considered institutional or sector policies and strategies that would utilize the credential ecology that I spoke to, or we're looking at a microcredential typology, an institution or country may want to consider accreditation or quality assurance of microcredentials. This is particularly hotly contested and debated issue in many countries. And I have spoken before to the experience of New Zealand, but there's Malaysia and quite a couple other countries that are actually looking at this issue as well. I would have looked at this issue recently coming out of a conference I hosted in 2000, a global conference in Trinidad and Tobago, where I would have led the National Accrediting Agency and would have gotten a clear mandate from institutions of tertiary education in the country to design a national qualifications microcredentialing framework. And so that microcredentialing framework facilitated institutional quality assurance systems that would encourage the alignment of institutional practices for microcredentialing to initial and continuing registration and accreditation cycles of the post-secondary and tertiary education institutions. And what we were able to do is to look at how that system and the standards and criteria we designed could facilitate the development of microcredentialing frameworks in institutions and the external quality assurance of such systems. But the diagram that I have here shows or depicts 6 components or individual ingredients that you may want to consider when you're looking at quality assurance within institutions and external quality assurance by accrediting agencies. The first is that institutions must undertake market research, looking at the labor and microcredential market that is currently in place to determine the possible demand for each microcredential or a suite of micro-credentials. The second looks at the issue of the competition that exists. Having analyzed the demand within a competitive market, the institutions would then want to look at this competitive market and clearly justify or make a case for why these micro-credentials or the suite of micro-credentials it intends to offer would be important, particularly for workforce development. The third would be the issues associated with designing the micro-credentialing system. The institutional micro-credential system should be designed to include the creation of single, multiple, or clusters of micro-credentials, which capture clearly how prior learning assessment is conducted and utilized for the award of micro-credentials. And the micro-credentialing itself will work to facilitate employee competence. The fourth component looks at the issues associated with developing and approving the micro-credentials. So there's a need for the institution to have a system in place for approving the micro-credentials within the organization that would allow for external approval or recognition by a body that quality assures that institution. And the fifth talks about the processes by which the institution manages learning, assessment, and credentialing processes in accordance with its policies and strategies. So the assessment of prior learning is included during this stage to ensure that the institution has taken account of the learner's prior learning to ensure that there's no duplication of effort where that learning is concerned. And the final area looks at the quality assurance processes. The institution will have to undertake a quality assurance process to look at its overall system of micro-credentialing. May need to want to examine the issues associated with a suite or cluster of micro-credentials or individual micro-credentials, depending on the preferred approach. So now I've come to my final thoughts, and thank you for listening to my presentation. Just to say that we cannot assure workforce quality through certification without adherence to quality frameworks and standards that are aligned to a national qualifications framework. The previous speaker would have identified some important considerations through an established qualifications framework that also supports alternative credentialing. So I wish to leave with you what I would regard as three very important recommendations that both policy organizations and regulatory organizations, including institutions offering new credentials, may want to think about when establishing frameworks and institutions. And so the first has to do with the issue of the philosophy, strategy, standards, and policy. The institutions and countries may want to determine the philosophy, the strategy, external quality assurance standards, and the policies that are needed to set up and deliver competency-based credentialing. Governance and management structures at such institutions should be introduced to ensure that the credentialing is legally recognized, accountable, and regulated to facilitate mobility of workers and, of course, persons who are accessing qualifications within an institution, moving from one micro-credential to another, from a nano-credential to a micro-credential, or from micro-credentials to macro-credentials. And finally, the country and institution should mutually support the design and administration of internal quality assurance systems at institutions that would encourage accreditation and micro-credentialing and the recognition of nano-credentials. And without having such, we would certainly be in a place where we would have unregulated, unqualified persons coming out of the workforce because they would have had essentially acquired certification that amounts to virtually nothing. And therefore, we would not want to have our workers in our countries exposed to having certifications that are not quality assured. So I wish to thank J-TEC for affording me the opportunity today to make my 2 cents of a presentation for you. And I really hope it would assist you as you deliberate on developing a quality workforce through new credentialing models and the value that flexible learning plays overall. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Just a point, your presentation was not being Sean. So I really hope that you'll be able to email it to us so we could share it.
Okay, I apologize. I thought it was being seen, and that's why I asked in the beginning if it was. But I will send it to you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to allow for a couple of questions. Dr. Kira Wallace, I recognize your hand was up. Is it a question for this presenter, or you may go ahead and make your comments if you're hearing me? Kira Wallace?
Yes. Brian Wallace.
Oh, Brian, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, it's Brian Wallace. Thank you. I picked the previous presenter. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Right. The question was relating to alternative learning, and I was just thinking about how can we now assess, especially in tertiary educational institutions, think about ways in which we could assess alternative learning as part of our prerequisite for entry into, because our system is very formal. We usually talk about the bachelor's, the master's level, and the doctorate. And so we want to look at how can we really, recognize alternative learning and treat it as part of the prerequisite for entry into tertiary educational institutions.
All right, thank you. Let me take that question and point it to some sources. The previous presentation, as you said, was looking at the qualification framework. Well, Dr. Ali also touched on it. Here at J-TEC, they are doing a lot of work as it relates to registering qualification. So they are developing a qualification register, right? To list all qualifications, and to map those qualifications so that both post-secondary institutions and the users of the system can know where they fit in accessing tertiary education. It's going to be, and I'm sure Dr. Black, listening to you, will promote soon the prior learning policy from J-TEC. I noted also we have Mrs. Sally Lawrence from the University of Technology, Jamaica, and they have a well-developed prior learning entry into their programs at UTech. And so you may want to look at the UTech model. But ideally, the qualification framework is to map qualifications that persons would have acquired over the years and to align it to where they want to go in terms of tertiary training. So I hope that answers your question. But you can get in touch with Dr. Black here at J-TEC because they're doing a lot of work as it relates to the National Qualification Register of Jamaica. You can also visit their website at qualifications.jtec.gov.jm.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Finnegan. May I just add to that?
Yes, go ahead.
Damien Black here. The prior learning assessment and recognition, and of course the conversation, and you would have heard Dr. Ali reference it, the whole matter of flexible learning pathways. The government of Jamaica is focused at this particular point in time on ensuring that we do have a system of flexible learning pathways at all levels of the educational system, primarily secondary, tertiary, and then to be able to assure the alignment across. But what Dr. Wallace has indicated is a critical question and issue. And so you correctly identified the fact that we are assessing, and certainly we have had conversations with the Council of Community Colleges of Jamaica with respect to some of their qualifications. and the other providers within Jamaica, including CXC, including City and Guilds, with respect to the alternative qualification that might suffice for accessing post-secondary, tertiary higher education. And so this is part of the agenda, and we will be proceeding accordingly.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Sandy Lawrence is up.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Right. Any questions for Dr.
Sandy
Ali?
Lawrence. Sandy Lawrence.
Sandy, go ahead.
Morning, colleagues.
Good morning.
So I want to raise a question. I noticed that we were told that the National Qualifications Registry is being developed, but I'm thinking that the focus of that will be on gathering information regarding qualifications that are offered within our tertiary educational institutions here. But I would want to ask, are there any plans to expand, whether it be the NQF or this particular qualifications registry, to facilitate the assessment of qualifications obtained outside of the region that persons might want to use to matriculate into our programs? So for example, a number of different kinds of qualifications, especially from the United States and the UK and even from Africa, that have come across my desk. There are challenges in assessing these because there really isn't a framework that exists to determine, at what point, at what level do these qualifications match up to the matriculation requirements for our institutions. So I'm wondering if there's any plan to expand the framework to help us to assess some of these kinds of qualifications to determine eligibility for entry into our courses of study.
All right, thank you, Dr. Black. I'm sure you are ready for that question.
Yes, I'm going to just ask Mrs. Seymour Hall to respond quickly to that matter in terms of the recognition of qualification, which is a process related to the cross-border qualifications as opposed to the placement of national qualifications and QFJ. Mrs. Hall?
Thank you, Dr. Black. Just to say, Mr. Finnegan, Ms. Lawrence, what we've done, we've actually established standards for the assessment of foreign qualifications, and those standards are in line with those recommended by UNESCO. We've actually started the process of assessing foreign qualifications. Persons may also apply to have their qualifications assessed through the same website that Mr. Finnegan spoke about earlier, qualifications.J-TEC, and I'll put it in the chat so that everyone will be able to see it. That website is currently being piloted by institutions as well, as we noted earlier, those who want to have the qualifications assessed and placed. So we have a few institutions that are on that pilot program, and we're looking at expanding it. Those individuals with foreign qualifications, they may apply and send the necessary documentation through that website as well. And we're going to be doing a lot of public education campaigns surrounding these developments as we seek to move the NQF to the next level. So thank you so much for asking that question.
Thank you, thank you. Not seen a raised hand, but let me, Dr. Ali, the way the world has moved for the millennials is from this 4-year college qualification to the micro-credential, which you outlined. But I've noted also that there's a shift towards new collar jobs. So you have blue collar, you have white collar, and then there's new collar jobs that doesn't require a 4-year degree. And what these youngsters are asking for is digital badging. So they don't want to walk around with any paper certificate. They want to have their qualification on their phone, so they can just email it when they go to an interview, etc., etc. What's your experience with digital badging? I saw Dr. Wayne Wesley on earlier. I don't know if CXC is moving in that direction. You may want to comment on that. The experience locally here in Jamaica is there's one examining body that is offering digital badging through, I think, Credly, CREDLY. And my observation is that the youngsters are very ecstatic about having their qualification that they can walk around with and not have it hang on a wall or put down somewhere at home. Can you comment on those digital badges?
Well, thank you for your question. I'd like to explore that issue in two different ways. The first has to do with the validation and the recognition of the digital badges broadly within institutional systems. And so, as I would have indicated to you earlier in my presentation, I apologize for you not having seen it, but I will get it to you. Generally speaking, with the emergence of digital badging, recognition systems are not necessarily modeling the extent to which those digital badging nano-credentials, as they're called, are to be considered both in terms of mobility within education institutions, as well as for persons who need the requirements for work purposes. Now, we also recognize a number of entrepreneurs who are emerging, and we have a lot of digital entrepreneurs who are emerging. And so for them, the value of digitalization and what it brings is critical to their own human empowerment and, of course, for their own purposes of social recognition. So countries need to, first of all, put the necessary frameworks in place to ensure clear articulation between nano-credentials, i.e. digital badges, micro-credentials, i.e. if we are talking about MOOCs, which are primarily online, or other forms of credentialing in the workforce, and of course the macro-credentialing, the traditional degrees offered. And that would allow, once we have the systems in place, there will be a more seamless articulation and mobility of learners across the system. The second comment I would like to make, and you've asked the questions about CXC. So we are exploring that generally, but in the context of professional development for those persons who are part of our education ecosystem and provide services to learners. And so, as you are aware, our primary remit is to work with teachers and persons who are in the assessment area to facilitate their competency development and the extent to which they are recognized through these alternative credentials so that they can contribute to their disciplines where they're employed, their fields where they're employed, whether they're in the classroom or they're administrators, or they're working even outside of the traditional education constructs. So our focus is with our Learning Institute that we are currently remodeling. And of course, for us, micro-credentialing and nano-credentialing are very critical steps. But having said that, while we might put our own recognition framework and schemes in place to support the recognition by us, we need to be assured that countries have similar systems in place that allows for the recognition of those persons, whether they are through the ministries of education and the relevant teachers' unions, etc. And finally, as it regards CXC as an organization, we have actually been taking steps to provide digital badges to our employees. And so we have what is called the Respect Initiative, which provides recognition for employees for work performed, particularly new initiatives and ideas that have gelled within the organization. And so our Respect Initiative provides for employees within the workforce to be recognized. And those digital badges provide that opportunity for them for mobility as well and for recognition for further employment.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your answer and for your very insightful presentation.
Just to say then words, you had asked.
Yes, Dr. Wayne.
Yes, you had asked, and in addition to what Dr. Ali would have explained, I saw where Rodney Payne was online, and I wanted him to perhaps jump in here. But as it relates to our digital credentialing in general now, not just the micro-credentialing, but all our certificates and diploma or associate degrees that we offer, we are now developing our e-certificates, we would call them. And that would be on what we call a blockchain technology. And we are actually working right now with the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, to have a system in place for the region. And that would incorporate both employers. You mentioned students wanting to walk around on their phone and be able to send their credential immediately to a potential employer, and that employer having the ability to validate the authenticity of the credentials being presented. So we are working on that. And that's a part of our e-transition or digital transformation, where we are now offering e-certificates, where persons can actually walk with their credentials electronically and share it with employers, universities, or any other entity that would want to validate their credential as being authentic.
Thank you, thank you. And Dr. Wayne Wesley, I tell you, you see your new product that we are all anticipating, the J-TEC. If you could allow for digital badging for that program, you don't have to even advertise it.
Well, that is always the goal with all products we're looking at introducing in the market, not just from a standpoint of the credential being presented in a digital format, but also the assessment being done in an electronic format. So Dr. Ali is actually leading on that, and I'm quite sure he will be very excited later on when we're ready to present this new credential to the market.
Right, thank you, thank you. This morning has really been wonderful. I ask that you just bear with us for the next 15 to 20 minutes as we have to close off this program. We have our Chief Executive Officer here at J-TEC, Dr. Damian Black. He will be introducing the final presentation, which is really about global badges and credential network. And so at this time, I'm going to turn over to our Chief Executive Officer and Commissioner of J-TEC, Dr. Damian Black. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Finnegan. I was indicating that there was a hand from Rodney Payne. I don't know if you wanted to allow him just a minute or so.
Yes, that we allow Rodney Payne, since Dr. Wayne had mentioned him, and I suppose he's from CXC, to speak to us.
Good morning, good afternoon all. Yes, I am CXC Director of Technological Innovation, and I just wanted to amplify what Dr. Wesley indicated, that we are at the point where we're doing some beta testing on the e-certification, and certainly the way it's positioned, the way it's designed, all of our future product can be delivered, whether it is micro-credential or the regular certificate that is now produced. In addition to that, it gives the candidate full control to expose at their discretion whatever certification they have achieved, and there's no longer a delay in requesting a transcript. You can give a fully validated credential immediately to the prospective employer or prospective institution. But one of the challenges that we have recognized, the receiving institution also has to reposition their mechanism to validate those credentials. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Black.
Thank you. Thank you. And then to you, Mr. Payne, and I think Dr. Wesley, the CEO, and your one other individuals involved here who may be in Barbados, it's appropriate that we say Happy Republic Day.
Yes.
Happy Republic Day to the Republic of the Barbados, as you made that transition. Yes.
And we trust that the rest of the region will join.
We follow suit. Okay. Take note, take note. We want to turn our attention to a video that has been shared by a gentleman, Graham Barkley, Barty, beg your pardon, whom I just met last week. Graham is a member of a network called International Council of Badges and Credentials. And they represent what I would call true believers, in inverted commas. They are passionate about the work, the possibilities, the options associated with digital badging and the provision of alternative credentials in what they would call a workforce development ecosystem. As I had indicated at the outset of the symposium, we are concerned about a significant social challenge that we face in Jamaica, namely the very high percentage of the prime working age population without certification. Francesco Pedro, in his presentation, pointed to the fact that a bit under 50% of students across the region graduate. This is just looking at the data when aggregated. Here in Jamaica, the issue is about 59% within the context of 1.5 times the normal period graduating, completing a particular program. The issues are significant. The issues point us to the need to respond critically and to respond now. The presenters so far this morning have highlighted common issues, equity, access, certainly the impact of the pandemic, we note. I was pleased to hear Dr. Malie Bassett in her remarks identify as a priority the diversification of the teaching learning space. This is one of the realities occasioned by massification, yes, but then certainly appreciative of the fact that the formal system needed this sort of overhaul to allow space for additional actors to come to the fore and to respond to the needs of the learners, the needs of the market. Technology is a critical issue, and certainly, yes, Southern New Hampshire, very innovative learning space, and clearly they have adopted through College of America the whole issue of competence-based education and credentialing. The assessment of learning is one issue that has come forward. I certainly appreciated what Dr. Pedro had to share in terms of the reform and review of the national qualifications frameworks, and then the need for a communication strategy to overcome the hurdle that this is something for professionals only. The current Minister of Education, Youth and Information, Mrs. Fable Williams, charged us here at J-TEC, and in my words, to ensure that the framework isn't passive, but rather it is active, engaging the issues that we face, engaging the challenges that we face. And so in looking at the framework, in looking at the qualifications register, in establishing what we are in the process of developing, Jamaica Credit Accumulation and Transfer System, it is to what extent will this impact go beyond the formal space and really affect those who are in need of access, in need of being able to move on and have their learning credentialed and credited. I certainly accept Dr. Ali's points about the philosophy, strategy, and standards for alternative credential in terms of ensuring that they are formed and awarded in keeping with globally benchmark standards. The critical matter, therefore, of this other group that I'm going to introduce, and they will be sharing with us via video, because even as we are meeting in this symposium, they are holding their first symposium in Berlin, Germany, as we gather. And so the wonderful group of professionals across the world, and indeed looking at this matter, as I said, of crafting a workforce development ecosystem. What would it look like? Certainly from the perspective of the regulator, Jamaica Tertiary Education Commission, regulation and compliance in order to satisfy, as you said, Dr. Ali, the requirements of quality, and that those with the credentials are able to use them to move in employment, to move in learning, additional learning, and then certainly migration, and to be able then to access opportunities given the affirmation and recognition of the credentials that they would hold. And so regulation and compliance, supporting career mobility, looking at worker skills, engagement, the tools, being able to assess what is required, you name it. But in looking at this whole matter of an ecosystem, we certainly appreciate the need to connect all education, training, capability, and capacity to map them into a single learning and work ecosystem. And this is what the project, that this conversation today will see us crafting in Jamaica, a human resource development strategy that incorporates and facilitates through the formal higher education system, utilizing the capacity and the capabilities within these institutions, within the workplace, within our human resource management practitioners, within the many training entities, with credentialed individuals, accredited individuals, being able to facilitate the credentialing that will be required. And then looking at the vehicles through which the credentialing will occur. So what are the key building blocks? What are the sequences for the deployment of those blocks? We want now to look at a conversation that we will be having as we move forward in this particular project. I invite you therefore to listen, to view and listen to this presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Graham Barty. I'm representing the International Council of Badges and Credentials, and I'm the co-lead of the Workforce Development and Engagement Work Group, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that this morning. So ICFBC is a network of educational, corporate, association and government organisations, and our goal is to develop and facilitate best practices on badges and credentials regionally and globally. And a link to the various working groups in ICFBC is shown here. First of all, let's discuss our emerging environment, global environment. On the left-hand side, we see the future of work, which will be dominated by automation, even smarter machines performing even more human tasks. By globalization, our workforce goes global. I go to the global workforce and the global workforce comes to me. And collaboration. I'm involved in many jobs with many employers and often at the same time. And the future of personal use is now ubiquitous digital access. We already manage our life online, and according to Stanford University, there's no such thing as going offline anymore. And we're moving beyond social media alone. It's about our personal data, our managing of that data, privacy controls, and using it for the purposes that I want to use it for, when I want to use it. And in the middle, we have this huge demographic change occurring with very large populations of young people emerging into the workforce. You know, the global talent pool of the future will come from these markets, hundreds of millions of young school graduates. So that means that our digital learner environment will change. These hundreds of millions of learners now have digital access to learning and training for the first time. They've got the internet, they have mobile smart devices, and they're ready to engage. They've emerged into a TikTok generation. They're digitally savvy, they're influencers, they create their own YouTube channels. And from an employer's point of view, we're seeing a new demand in this digital environment for future skills to manage these new tools and capabilities more effectively. And of course, we're now talking about transitioning to lifelong learning and career management, not just participate in a degree once and never be trained again. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that. So what do workers want? Well, according to this Canadian survey, it's quite simple. They want training that will get them a job, perhaps under the Great Resignation and post-pandemic, some of those things will change in what that represents. But they want affordable training, they want flexible courses when they can undertake them, the time of their choosing. They want the courses to be accessible in the way that they can find them and participate in them. And they also want pathways to formal education. And that same survey said that employers want more than just a technical skill. They want durable skills. And America Succeeds refers to durable skills as the technical competency in the skill itself, but it also refers to the character of an individual to be able to participate in a work environment. And they also want competencies to be accredited. They want to be satisfied that that individual has been proven to be able to do the tasks they say they can. And of course, their ultimate goal, which they clearly state, is increased productivity and efficiency and improved return on investment and profitability. Makes sense. The Future Skills Centre of Canada, I think, has come up with a very interesting definition for digital fluency for the workforce, which we find interesting. And that definition says that they want to develop a series of stackable, add them all together, give you a whole competency over a time of digital fluency micro-credentials to better equip underrepresented individuals and to transition to and within the workforce, and to provide employers the ability to recruit and retain digitally fluent workers in a timely and cost-effective manner. All of those things that are highlighted on that definition, I think, are important to workforce development and engagement. And so we know that there's an increasing role for micro-credentials. UNESCO defines credentials as macro-credentials and micro-credentials. Macro-credentials are mostly tertiary or diplomas, formal institutions, higher level learning. And micro-credentials can be non-formal, informal. So a good example of a non-formal micro-credential would be the use of Grammarly. Grammarly sends you a report regularly about your Grammarly activity, your spelling mistakes, how much content you've produced, how you compare to others, and gives you a badge. Now, if I was a young person in one of those emerging markets looking for a job in journalism or media or reporting, I've got something that I can show to a potential employer that I can write and that I have a competency in that particular skill set that might be attractive to them. It's not formal, there's no certification, there's no assessment, it's just Grammarly choosing to decide, what my performance is, but it's free and it gives me something to talk to an employer about. I think that's important. And informal, I think a good example of that is, these YouTube influencer type channels. So if you're a young 15 or 16-year-old boy or girl in one of these environments, you've got a particular skill set in music or some form of creative activity, and you create a YouTube channel, you pick up 2 million subscribers, you get 1 million views a posting, and you monetize that. Well, is that more valuable to a potential employer than, say, a 6 to 12 week marketing and media communications course at a vocational college? I think an employer would see that informal YouTube success as being pretty attractive and of interest to their business. And of course, in your environment, we now have formal training, which of course is always important, but because of cost and access and physical presence is becoming harder to attain, I guess. So in the case of higher education, there is a supplementary role for micro-credentials, and I've got a chart to show you that. It's clearly critical for employers, particularly very large employers like IBM. IBM can't wait 4 years for a computer scientist to get their degree. They need to be deploying people in the field now. And so providing you've got the competency in that particular skill set attained in that particular micro-credential, you're employable by IBM, no degree required. And this will continue to grow, I think, over time. And it's also critical for individual worker engagement and ability. It gives me a micro-credential. It says that I can do this. It's proven, and I can apply for those roles. So for higher education, clearly micro-credentials are relevant to undergraduates, to postgraduates and lifelong career capability, and also to faculty. But my personal view is they clearly don't replace the degree itself. They're supplementary activities to compensate. I might have a degree in a master's in biochemistry, but that doesn't mean I can run a lab. And so perhaps a micro-credential in running a lab is of interest to the employer in addition to my professional qualification. So in the ICOBC working group study for workplace development and engagement, we're trying to look at global best practice and what current examples might be. So examples for employers. I just mentioned IBM, but also nations that are rolling this out. Probably Germany, is in the lead, but Australia and Canada, US are thinking strongly about this. There are others, and so what represents that best practice, and in that best practice, what are the building blocks, and is there a sequence for those building blocks? So if someone wants to kick off in this capability in a new environment, they don't need to start at the wrong end. They can start at the building block that, in the sequence they should, to get the speediest and most efficient outcome. We think that's a valuable contribution. And so an industry competency model and its building blocks might look something like this. Personal effectiveness competencies, academic competencies, workplace competencies, industry-wide technical competencies, industry sector technical competencies, and then occupational competencies. And clearly, you don't get those in one go. That's a series of stackable credentials, both macro and micro, non-formal, informal, and formal, over a period of time, which you need to aggregate. And on the left-hand side, you have all the training and education that lead you to get those skills. And on the right-hand side, you have the badges that will represent the digital proof that you've undertaken that activity and you've been given those awards. And those three components will all go together, we believe, in workforce development and engagement in the global workforce. And that's a kind of model we're trying to build and express. So thank you very much. I hope that's been of some interest and that you enjoy the rest of your sessions today. Thank you.
By video, and we want to acknowledge this group. They will participate with us in terms of the journey that we are embarking on. And indeed, as I said in the outset of my remarks a while ago, we certainly appreciate the contributions today of all who have shared and spoken. We look forward to, from the perspective of Jamaica Tertiary Education Commission, and speaking on behalf of the Minister and the Ministry, the contributions to be made by way of the World Bank Group, UNESCO's ESALC. Certainly we will continue to interface with CXC in looking at their credentialing, and indeed the ICOBC, as we pull together the task force to move ahead with the goal of strategically responding to the gaps where certification, continuing education and training are concerned, and being able to reduce the levels, very high levels, unfortunately so, the negative impact on productivity, just being able to progress personally and professionally within Jamaica. And so thank you so very much. Over to you, Mr. Finnegan.
Thank you, Dr. Black. I really want to extend thanks to Dr. Roberto Meli Bassett for sharing with us today. I also want to extend thanks to Francesco Pedro and Dr. Ali, and all you individuals who found the time to be here. The video will be up, and so you can go and share with your colleagues. The J-TEC will be having a similar forum, more in a local perspective, early next year. So look out for those activities. The discussion is critical if we are going to move this economy forward, if we're going to build our workforce. Certification, enhancing workforce quality through certification is paramount for our region. A certified worker is far more competent in most cases. They pay attention to safety, and their self-esteem tend to go up about tenfold, having a certificate to show for the work they're doing. There's too many Jamaicans who are working in fields that they do not have certificate to show for their work. And so we look forward to the work being done by J-TEC as it relates to the qualification register. We look forward to more tertiary institutions embracing alternative qualifications, because for us to attract more foreign direct investment in the region, our labor pool must be able to show certification for the work that is required. And so I want to thank you for being here, and hopefully you'll join the conversation, the ongoing conversation, and improving our workforce as we reposition for this post-COVID. You see, COVID has created three categories of workers. One, the essential workers. Two, displaced workers. And three, remote workers. And all the categories would need upskilling and reskilling to be able to survive in this post-COVID era. Thank you. I'll allow for the CEO of J-TEC to have the final word in his wrapping up and to indicate the next steps. You're muted.
Yes, no, it's okay. I've done that already, my brother. We're good to go. Just to say thank you to everybody. Thank you, Mr. Finnegan, for moderating, bringing your wealth of experience, your background in TVET, your engagement at Heart NSTA and in the ministry as director of TVET. I know your colleagues are on. I see my good friend Orville Plummer is on board. Welcome, Orville. So we're just acknowledging everyone who joined, and we are looking forward certainly to the progress continuing. Okay, good. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. All the best. Enjoy lunch, everyone. Good. Signing off at this time.
Do you have a skill? Do you have a certificate to show that you are qualified? A degree, perhaps? Are you wondering what your qualification is worth? If so, you need to know about the National Qualifications Framework of Jamaica, the NQFJ. I am Monique Price, and I'll be telling you about the NQFJ. It is a tool that classifies all qualifications in the country. It recognizes qualifications, knowledge, and skills. The framework describes for you what learners should know, understand, and be able to do on the basis of a given qualification. It was developed as a requirement of Jamaica's Vision 2030 development plan to assist in the transformation of Jamaica's education sector. There are several benefits of the NQFJ. It allows your qualifications to be recognized in other countries. It means if you earned your qualification in Jamaica, it can be legally accepted and easily recognized in another country. It shows the equivalency of qualifications across learning sectors and regions around the globe. It increases access to higher education through flexible learning pathways that recognize formal, informal, and non-formal learning. It sets standards that evaluate the quality, validity, and relevance of qualifications. There are 10 established qualification levels, ranging from Access 1, which is basic, to doctoral studies. The NQFJ covers all learning sectors including general, secondary, technical and vocational, and tertiary education. Plus, it allows for the development of prior learning assessment and recognition, as well as credit accumulation and transfer systems. All qualifications placed under the framework are national qualifications provided by entities legally operating in Jamaica. For further details on how the NQFJ works, please visit jtec.gov.jm or call 876-977-5115. Go higher, move up the levels with the NQFJ.
Good day, I'm Gabrielle Thompson with an item of interest just in. The Jamaica Tertiary Education Commission, J-TEC, is reporting that persons who have learned skills and competencies through experience are now able to get qualified. This is done through the Prior Learning Assessment and Recognition (PLAR) component of the Commission's National Qualification Framework of Jamaica, NQFJ. The PLAR identifies, documents, and assesses prior learning. Getting qualified through PLAR is for persons who have gained experience in various jobs and volunteer activities through a hobby, interests, independent study, or through training courses. Assessing prior learning takes into consideration your portfolio, results of a challenge exam. This component of the NQFJ include eliminating learning duplication. It increases self-confidence in learners, validates learning through work and life experience, identifies areas that require further study, and encourages learners to pursue further communication. J-TEC says people who fall in these categories are capable of getting hired because they can actively demonstrate their skills through the portfolio of work they have developed. Stay tuned for more items of interest.
So go call mommy about this. So good. Hi, mommy. Were you watching TV? Yeah, breaking news just came in to say that you can get certified based on your experiences, skills, and portfolio. You remember when you were thinking about getting certified in domestic work? Yeah, well, you can contact J-TEC because you've been doing this for a very long time. All you have to do is visit their website at www.jtec.gov.jm, or you can call them at 876-977-5115.